everyone, I'm Beck Lowe and I'm doing my first year, or just coming up to the end of my first year of my PhD at the University of Worcester, and I've just completed my attendance at Brunel University's Interdisciplinary Bodies Conference, and what a conference it's been. So the conference spanned 3 days, and there were a multitude of different kinds of talks around bodies, and I'm just blown away by some of the knowledge and the talent that I've seen. On top of that, it was a very artistic conference, which is not something I've really experienced before. I mean, bear in mind, this is my first big conference that I've attended, but nevertheless, I didn't expect it to be this level of artistry, and that was kind of surreal and kind of nerve-wracking because I haven't been in the artsy kind of scene for quite a while, and when I kind of came into this conference, I was coming in there with just like the academic hat on. So I'm going to get into what I'm talking about. My presentation title is What's in a Label? A Researcher's Reflection on Neuroqueer Identities for Bodies That Simply Won't Fit In. So why neuroqueer? Because my research trajectory has encompassed both the neuro-ness and the queerness, although I started with the queerness, now I'm in the neuro-ness. In my master's, I did a qualitative study on gender diverse perspectives on the period positive movement, and that was a really invaluable experience. But today, it's the neurodivergence identities that intrigue me. I believe, based on my positionality, that these are closely intertwined with one another, and I want to tap into that as I go into exploring neurodivergence and identity in my PhD. So, for context, I've struggled with the idea of fitting in all my life, being deeply insecure about it. Part of this I put down to my upbringing. I was raised working class and then shifted into middle class, and I felt like I really didn't belong to either. Similarly, I never felt like I fitted in with the ideal body type. McDonald's was a love language in my family, and that's kind of stuck. Nevertheless, I always felt like there was something off about my sense of belonging. I always struggled to make and sustain friendships, and I always felt like an outsider looking in. This all came to a head during lockdown, when I was in my late 20s, and lockdown afforded me a lot more time to reflect. I would uncover new gender labels on social media. Being someone whose body never fitted in with the ideal effeminate body type, but equally being someone who never really identified with the other half of that man-woman gender binary, the subversive non-binary label really resonated with me. So, with that, I identify as non-binary. I'm flexible on pronouns though, so don't worry too much on that. But offline, the world isn't really ready for my kind of expression bodily, my physicality as a non-binary person, not in my small white middle class town at least. So I still felt deeply insecure and jaded by that, to the point where I was privileged enough to go ahead and get some counselling. Interestingly, it was then that my counsellor asked me a question that would change the course of my life forever, which sounds dramatic, but it's true. She asked me, have you ever considered that you might be on the autism spectrum? I hadn't actually considered that because I had a very narrow view of what autism looked like. It was very Rain Man adjacent, and I hadn't really looked into it in any depth. But upon going online, I found this whole world of new autism discourse, particularly around the emergence of female presentations of autism. This is thanks to the so-called neurodiversity movement, which celebrates neurological differences as natural variances that we all have to varying levels. So autism, ADHD, and other neurological differences are just that, differences, not disorders to be cured. The neurodiversity movement boomed in conjunction with the rise in social networking, as neurodivergent people could more easily speak on their nuances and their experiences online than they could perhaps offline. Combine this with people reading and relating to their experiences, and whole language around autism was starting to shift. Today, we see people lay diagnosing each other with a touch of autism, which I actually don't hate, I think that's quite funny, and neurospicy and things like that. In the academic world, we see the words neuroqueer, for example, which is a neurodivergent lens through which to view queer theory. But again, the issue is offline. The world isn't necessarily ready for this drastic shift in autism discourse. So people would see this stuff online and then seek support on the NHS here in the UK, only to find that they'd have to wait 18 months to 3 years to receive a clinical assessment. So in response to that, the neurodiversity movement inspires self-advocacy, backing yourself in the face of clinical biases, resource shortages, and outdated assumptions for what autism looks like, such as the assumptions that I made before I learned more. You see, though self-advocacy coalesces into identifying with and self-identifying, which in turn would then be conflated with this idea of self-diagnosis, which is why we see the popular hashtag self-diagnosis is valid. Of course, self-diagnosis, and the word diagnosis here is used quite loosely in this context, because if you think about it, the neurodiversity movement is saying that autism and ADHD and other neurological differences aren't disorders, so there's not really something to be diagnosed medically per se. I think that's just to help us understand the experience of identifying with this, albeit slightly oxymoronic, I suppose. It's worth noting that actually this is kind of a point of contention for people with higher level support needs who are autistic. And so that's something to consider, and that's something that I'm really interested in. So anyway, back to me, because it's all about me. I'm joking. I wanted to explore this further because I felt like all this autism talk really resonated with me, even more than the non-binary stuff did. So I needed to get confirmation of this. So I did my own very non-academic research on the area. I took online assessments, I spoke to my parents in depth about it, I looked at school reports, and I essentially built a binder of evidence indicating that I was on the autism spectrum. So in that regard, I was kind of self-diagnosing when you really think about it, because I was seeking confirmation rather than seeking a yes or no kind of answer. But it should be noted that I was seeking out the prominent markers of autism in me, and then maybe inadvertently or advertently, conveniently leaving behind any indicators that might suggest I was not on the spectrum. That's just some food for thought. The thing is, due to my deep insecurities, I couldn't trust my own judgment, so I still wanted a clinical opinion. But here's the other thing. I'm very impatient when I'm self-absorbed, which is often. So I wanted a clinical diagnosis sooner than the 18 months to 3 years waiting time. So what did I do in my privilege? Well, I took out a loan and I booked onto the same service that's on the NHS but privately, so that I could essentially skip the queue and receive a diagnosis within a few months. And I got what I paid for. After 4 rigorous assessments, I was clinically diagnosed autistic. And of course I trust them, they're the same clinicians that you would get on the NHS. And all it takes is for me to attend one of these conferences to realise just how much I struggle with those in-person social interactions. So I do believe in my diagnosis, and I do call myself autistic for it. But here's the thing, as much as I wanted autism to validate me, it was not enough for me. So when I got that diagnosis, I felt liberated and vindicated for a bit. But within a year, I was still seeking out other possible diagnoses and potentially self-diagnosing. OCD, ADHD, even Ehlers-Danlos syndrome came up. These are all things that I'd been algorithmically shown through social media, having used social media as a tool for exploring autism before. And so there was kind of this reciprocal effect, this algorithmic mimesis, if you will. So I want to address the absurdity of being a privileged person seeking themselves. I essentially skipped the queue to find myself. Other people are waiting in line still to this day just to get a clinical opinion so that they can survive in this society constructed against them. But here I am lamenting over the fact that, oh, well, that label didn't really explain everything for me. It didn't really explain away all the other issues that I'm reflecting on. Meanwhile, I'm still able to pay off my loan while other people can't afford to do that. And those people need that diagnosis for support. Whereas I wasn't going into it for support. I was going into it to be able to forgive myself and to be able to explain myself to people preemptively out of my own insecurities. Oh, the reason I behave like that is because I'm autistic. The reason I struggle with friendships, it's autism. and so forth. Much as I resent that part of me and feel the need to repent by laying my cards on the table, which is another absurdity, the irony of seeking validation by presenting validation-seeking themes in my talk, I also know that I'm not alone. And on top of that, I feel the need to say that I don't think it's down to the individual. I don't think the onus should be on the individual. I think rather it's a cultural issue, and I'm more interested in why it is our society makes us go in these directions. Why do they make us feel like others that need to find ourselves through these labels? That's what I'm interested in. It's that sort of culture, and then just underneath that, the philosophical level that I'm really wanting to tap into. If I'm allowed to speculate, based on one of my favourite scholars, the late Mark Fisher, I would say capitalism and neoliberalism might have something to do with this. Damn it, McDonald's. We are told in these contexts that we can achieve anything and be anything we want to be, but we all know that that's far from the case, and there tends to be a lot of prerequisites that come with that. And there are a lot of other things as well that are well beyond our control that prevent us from being able to achieve what everyone else achieves. On top of that as well, if everyone's successful, then there's no progress once everyone's achieved success, so someone's got to come underneath, right? So it's always going to be slightly rigged. Post-feminism promotes empowerment on a sort of girl boss level in the main, but under the watchful eye of neoliberalism, that girl boss game is rigged. So, and this is purely speculation and just me thinking out loud, perhaps we're trying to find ourselves because we're trying to reconcile our perceived failings in the context of our culture and society through this self-othering and self-marginalisation, coming together as a group of others who can rightfully call into question what we call typical or normal in our capitalist, neoliberalist, post-feminist context. With that being said, all this could sound like I'm kind of dismissing people's neurodivergent experiences out of hand by considering these perspectives of self-diagnosis as just ways to cope, which I don't want to do. That can kind of seem to gravitate towards the anti-psychiatry stance, and while they have some interesting points, I don't want to box myself into a particular camp. I want to try and understand as many perspectives as possible. But all of this is to say that there's an undercurrent of paradox going on, this trying to rebel by trying to find labels, the restrictions and the liberations that come with these labels. And then on top of that, there's the paradox of being a privileged researcher who's trying to speak on social justice issues, which might be experienced very differently by marginalised people that don't have the opportunity to speak. So with all of that being said, what's my PhD? So I'm in my first year, it's very early stages, but I've gotten an idea of my research question. How are perspectives on self-diagnosed autism shaped by socio-cultural and generational contexts? Although I'm in the early stages of the recruitment phase, I know I want to interview people who might have otherwise been overlooked in the current neurodiversity literature, because a lot of the neurodiversity literature promotes self-diagnosis being valid, without question, without inquiry, without context. And as much as I can understand that, and as much as I completely get that the resources are short and there are biases, and so people are coming together to self-diagnose, I also know just from anecdotal things I've seen online that there are some people who have some questions around that, particularly in, like I say, the areas where there are people with higher support needs, or there are people from different economic backgrounds, or people from different generations. I'm taking an absurd interpretivist approach to this research in order to explore people's subjectivities in their multitude, rather than trying to seek out one objective reality that rules over all perspectives. The constructivist grounded theory approach enables me to let the data speak for it themselves, a theoretical idea emerging from the ground up, if you will. So I won't be going into this with a preconceived theory in mind that would skew my research in favour of my own biases. Nevertheless, I will also be theoretically sensitive, so I'll be taking into account the theories of, say, Mark Fisher, Giddens, Bourdieu, whoever else. This approach forces me to be reflexive. The interpretivist stance puts everyone's subjective realities on a level playing field, and that includes my own, and I have to be very aware of the fact that my interpretations of their interpretations are going to be funneled through my own biases and contexts. And constructivist grounded theory ensures that I'm not only aware of that on a theoretical level, but also through memoing, I'm aware of it on a personal and researcher level. The absurdist aspect, though, albeit relating more to my positionality than the research approach directly, really gets to the nitty-gritty of the paradox of seeking meaning in a climate where meaning is thwarted and constantly eluding us. Absurdism, unlike nihilism, which says that nothing matters because existence is meaningless, takes a more creative approach by saying we might not know philosophically where we stand, and we might not be able to find meaning in our existence, but we certainly try. The bottom line with my research approach is that I'm kind of sick and tired of hearing my own point of view on it, but I really think context is key here, because what's in a label when all's said and done? Autism to me means everything and nothing. Socially, it means everything, because I get to navigate the world more safely and feel more ontologically secure in that space. Philosophically, though, it doesn't really mean much. It's only the tip of the iceberg when there's so many more nuances and fluid contexts that come and go and shape who I am on a daily basis. But for others, those labels mean everything because they can only have access to exploring the societal aspects, given that they haven't got the privilege to be able to sit back. They're just trying to survive. So that label, autism, is their means of survival, their access to support, their community, their sense of belonging, and their means of existing safely in a world of uncertainty. So with that, thank you so much for listening to my ramble. I hope that it provoked some thought, and if you want to discuss this further, you know where I am.